So welcome all. I'm very happy and thrilled to host Martin Hellman. As you probably know, but I will remind you all in case you've forgotten, he is Professor Emeritus at Stanford University. He has numerous honors for the invention of public key cryptography. He's also an accomplished glider pilot with strong concern for nuclear weapons, and thus the title of the talk. Help me in welcoming him by giving him a warm applause.
Well, thank you, Tanya. And as Tanya said, three of my passions are soaring, flying gliders, cryptography, and not nuclear weapons aren't a passion, but making sure we don't use them is. And how could those three possibly be tied together? Now, the main goal of the talk is really to talk about nuclear weapons, and which is something most of you probably haven't heard anybody bring it up for years. If at all, it's been with respect to nuclear terrorism, and even then only very occasionally. The threat of nuclear war between the United States and Russia is supposed to be your father's Oldsmobile or maybe your grandfather's Oldsmobile. And by the end of the talk, I hope you'll see, I hope I'll have convinced you that the risk is unfortunately alive and well, but fortunately you can play a role in helping change that and get the risk down to an acceptable level. Now, I could start off the talk with a slide like that, but that is singularly unattractive, right? So instead, we'll approach the subject from the point of view of soaring as the entree. I have a plane just like this. It's called a STEMI or STEMA S10VT motor glider. Now it does have an engine, but in the maneuver shown here, the engine is stowed and there's no way the pilot could get the engine out in time to save himself. And the question is, what is he doing? And it's not me, because as you'll see in a minute, this is a maneuver I do not do. Now this pilot is very experienced, has practiced this maneuver many times, takes many precautions, so I'm not saying he should not be doing it, but it's something that many glider pilots undertake without really adequate precaution, in my opinion. It's a high-speed, low pass. In a high-speed, low pass, the pilot starts about a mile from the runway and about 1,500 feet altitude, depends on the particular glider. He then dives, he or she, then dives down the ground coming up at a great rate, and then does a sharp pullback on the stick so that the glider is flying right, skimming the runway at 150 miles an hour, basically very close to its VNE speed. It's never exceed velocity. At the end of the runway, the pilot then does a sharp pull-up, reconverting some of that speed into altitude, about 400 or 500 feet of altitude, so he can turn safely and land. Now you might wonder, since there's no engine in a pure glider, and even in that case there's no time to deploy the engine, how can the pilot be guaranteed that she'll have enough altitude at the midpoint of that maneuver to turn safely and land? Well, the laws of physics provide what seems like an ironclad guarantee. We know how energy is conserved, exactly how altitude and speed are changed. There are losses due to the glider, but those losses are a known quantity which are factored in. So the laws of physics provide a guarantee, but it's important to read the fine print in the guarantee. There's a model that guarantee assumes, and that is that the air is still. Now, if there's a slight wind, or a slight updraft or downdraft, it's a minor perturbation, and instead of doing 150 miles an hour, the pilot might be doing 148 or 152 miles an hour, not a problem. But a friend of mine, and some of you here are, I know at least one of you is a glider pilot, this is Kempton Izuno, who used to do these maneuvers, doesn't do them anymore because he had a scare. What happened was as he started the dive, he hit an unusually strong and sustained downdraft. There was an air circulation pattern like this that was setting up, and he was in the downdraft. So while he's diving, he's also being pushed down at about 1,000 feet a minute. So when he hits the threshold of the runway, instead of doing 150 miles an hour, he's doing about 100. And there's a huge, with 1/2 mv squared, there's a huge difference between 100 and 150 miles an hour. He was really scared and was afraid he was going to crash. Now, he's a fantastic pilot, and also he had a lot of luck. He managed to pull it off without hurting himself or his glider, but he doesn't do them anymore. Now, a year and a half ago, I gave a talk at the local, the Northern California Soaring group. It's called PASCO, Pacific Area Soaring Council, at their safety seminar. My talk was called Complacency, What Me Worry, and I argued that the most dangerous maneuvers in soaring might well be those that are 99.9% safe. At first, that sounds like an oxymoron. How can something that's 99.9% safe be the most dangerous maneuver? Well, in general aviation, and in fact in flying in general, the opposite of safe is often dead. I mean, there are intermediate states where you only get hurt or the plane only gets damaged, but there's a much higher fatality rate in crashes than with automobiles, for example. And if it's 99.9% safe and the alternative is death, what's the probability that you kill yourself? 1 in 1,000, 1/10 of 1%. That doesn't sound so good. It's totally equivalent, but it's, you can begin to see why it's not particularly a safe maneuver if it is 99.9% safe. Worse, if you do a maneuver that's 99.9% safe 100 times in the course of your flying career, and high-speed low passes are something that many pilots will do about 100 times. In fact, some contest finishes, these are glider races, require a low pass, although there's a move within the community to change to a higher altitude finish so that things are safer. But if you do it 100 times in the course of your flying career, and there's 1 chance in 1,000 of killing yourself each time, that's a 10% fatality rate, which helps explain why every once in a while I read about one of these maneuvers that I argued might be 99.9% safe. I don't know the exact number, but something on that order. And an experienced pilot who's done them many times before is inexplicably killed doing it, and what happened, no one knows. I think it was just the tail of the distribution. And with the economic crisis we're in right now, people are realizing that the tails of distributions are fatter than most people give them credit for. It's the black swan type idea. Now, a similar law, just like the laws of physics, are invoked to tell the glider pilot that she'll be able to land safely doing that high-speed low pass. There's a law of nuclear deterrence that is invoked by most people to feel comfortable about the fact that we have roughly 25,000 nuclear weapons in the world today. That's come down quite a bit from roughly 75,000 20 years ago, but it's still a horrendous number. And the basic idea, it's called mutually assured destruction. If we were to attack the Russians, if the Russians were to attack us, then the retaliation would be so horrendous that both nations would be destroyed. No one in his or her right mind would start such a mess. Well, and they point to the fact that only 21 years elapsed between the first 2 world wars, and yet we've gone 63 years, almost 64, without another world war, and that's attributed at least partly and probably correctly to nuclear deterrence or mutually assured destruction. But it's important to read the fine print. Is nuclear deterrence a 99.9% safe maneuver or strategy? And over what period of time? Is it 99.9% safe per day, in which case we expect a catastrophe in 3 years, which would be horrendous? Or is it 99.9% safe per year, in which case we expect a catastrophe on average to occur in 1,000 years? Which sounds pretty good until I was talking with Tanya. She has a new baby that has a expected lifetime of 100 years, roughly, order of magnitude. That would be a 10% risk, which is horrendous. You take these babies and you put them, is it on their back or their stomachs these days? On their backs. I mean, we go through all these things for the 1 in a million chance that something will happen to this baby, and here's probably a greater than 10% risk that most people are ignoring. And if you look at the last 50 years, because we only have had enough weapons to call it nuclear deterrence for about 50 years, there have been some major near misses. Korea in 50 and 53 were more minor. China, Taiwan, which by the way could come back to haunt us today. China has an emotional attachment to Taiwan that's comparable to the attachment we would have if Texas were to follow its state constitution and secede from the Union. And yet we've been shipping weapons to Taiwan, totally oblivious to how this impacts the mainland China. In Berlin in 1961, there was a standoff. American tanks and Russian tanks at Checkpoint Charlie each had orders to fire if fired upon. Thank God a car didn't backfire. The most serious event was almost surely the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, and I'll go into that in more detail for that reason. Mideast wars in the 50s, the 67 war even, but the 73 war, there's some evidence, may have been almost as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis in some ways. Able Archer is something almost no one's heard about. How many of you have heard of Able Archer? Okay, about 10%. In 1983, this was in the first Reagan term in office, first Reagan administration. Now, there's a big difference between the first administration and the second. In the second, he made friends with Gorbachev, and there was a lot of nice talk, and the world got a lot safer. But in the first administration, those of you old enough to remember, that was when, for a mic test, mic's off, Mr. President, say anything you want. Okay, I've outlawed the Soviet Union. The bombing begins in 5 minutes, was his mic test. Fortunately or unfortunately, the mic was live, and the whole world heard that. But there was that kind of attitude, even if that had not occurred, even if that had not become public knowledge. And Reagan was, in many ways, just more honest about our nuclear weapons policy. President Carter, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, actually put in place the plans for building the Euro missiles, which Reagan admittedly accelerated and got a lot of flack for. And so Reagan was not so much more reckless than previous presidents, as perhaps more honest than previous presidents, and for that I think we owe him a debt of gratitude. Anyway, his honesty scared something out of the Russians, and Andropov, who was in charge of the Soviet Union at this point in time, became paranoid, according to Gates's memoirs, From the Shadows, which I strongly recommend to you. This is the current Secretary of Defense. But when you go back and read what Reagan was saying, whether it was paranoia or legitimate fear is an open question. Andropov became paranoid, according to Gates, that Reagan felt that he could execute a successful first strike against the Russian missiles. That is, we had enough power that we could knock out the Russian missiles on the ground before they could ever get in the air, and we would win a nuclear war with the Russians and be unscathed. Now, to do something like that would require tremendous coordination and a lot of communications flowing, which the Russians would, of course, notice. And so the Russians concluded that if Reagan were to do this, he would do it under the guise of a military exercise, but the exercise would just be the cover for the real operation. Able Archer was exactly such an exercise to practice the coordinated release of all NATO nuclear weapons in 1983. And how close we came is not clear, but Gates seems to feel that it may have even been comparable to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, is the threat of nuclear war, well, let's see, I haven't gotten there quite yet. Okay, yeah. Is the threat of nuclear war our fathers' or grandparents' Oldsmobile? Is it a thing of the past? That was then. Isn't the Cold War over? Well, let's read the fine print. There's many places where fine print appears in the deterrence guarantee, but perhaps the most important is the NATO Charter, which says an attack on one NATO nation shall be considered an attack on them all. In May of last year, just a year ago, I noticed an article in the Wall Street Journal. I'd been focused on Estonia as the possible flashpoint for reasons that will become clear in the next bullet. But in May, I started paying attention to Georgia because the Wall Street Journal had this article buried deep in the newspaper because it's the news that no one wants to read because who's worrying about that? And it said, it warned that Russia and Georgia were close to war. This was over the Russian downing of a Georgian reconnaissance drone that had flown through a no-fly zone without adequate warning, so maybe the Russians denied shooting it down. Of course, we denied that the U-2 that Gary Powers flew over Russia was an American plane. So this lying is not something that uniquely the Russians do. It's something all nations do on things like this. And of course, just 2.5 months later, August 7th, war did break out. It surprised most people, but if you were watching, you could see the tremors that preceded these earthquakes. And somewhat surprisingly, although maybe not surprisingly, but very dangerously, most Americans, when that war broke out, called for admitting Georgia to NATO even more rapidly. Now, how that works out in terms of our safety is an interesting question. On my website, which I'll give you the URL for at the end of the talk, I have on the resource tab, there are a number of emails I sent out around this time to people who'd asked for updates. And I have quotes from Reagan advisors and Nixon advisors, so not, left-leaning liberals, who basically say Georgia started that war, and if the United States wanted to pick a country of less strategic importance to us, it would be hard to find one with less strategic importance than Georgia, and it would be hard to, and it was ruining our relations with Russia, where we had many strategic interests that were being really hurt by this incorrect view of the situation. But if Georgia comes into NATO, and this were to happen again, we would be treaty bound to attack the Russians. I mean, let's get serious about this. This is not something that we should do without really thinking it through. And by the way, as we speak, NATO exercises are going on in Georgia over great objections from the Russians. Imagine how we would feel if the Warsaw Pact still existed and there were Warsaw Pact exercises going on in Mexico or even Venezuela or Cuba. Now, a year earlier, in April 2007, this is one of the things that got me focused more on Estonia, which is still a potential flashpoint. It's just not in anyone's radar screen, very few people's radar screens. Estonia has a population that is 1/3 ethnically Russian that moved there during the Soviet era. And the Estonians are playing payback. They are subjugating the Russians roughly the same way the Russians subjugated the Estonians. There's some objections to that. We can talk about that later. Amnesty International has a report out on the human rights abuses in that country. Now, I was in Estonia in '73. I saw the other side of it. I saw what the Russians were doing to the Estonians. The bottom line is, whoever is responsible there, Estonia is a member of NATO, and this was a cyber attack, and NATO, Estonia viewed it as comparable to September 11th, and there was questioning within NATO if Russia, it wasn't clear who it attacked, although there was strong suspicions it emanated from Russia. If Russia had physically attacked communications in Estonia, then NATO would obviously have to respond. If it's a cyber attack, what's the difference? And by the way, in all this, I should point out that in 1991, Gorbachev thought he was given assurances that NATO would never expand beyond the West German border. And so the Russians feel somewhat double-crossed in this. Whether or not the Russians are right in feeling that way, I'll leave up to you to discover. There's some reading I can suggest. It was Secretary of State Baker who made the statement. Let's examine the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, because that is and so the point of the last slide is the threat did not go away with the end of the Cold War. Estonia, Georgia, whichever view you take as to who's at fault there, are potential flashpoints for hostilities between the United States and Russia. Pakistan is another possibility. If that country continues its descent into chaos, both Russia and the United States might well send troops in to secure the nuclear weapons. You now have American and Russian troops in a potential battle zone, not a good situation. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis surprised almost everybody. It seemed to come out of nowhere. But again, just like the Georgian War surprised people, it's because they weren't paying attention to the warning signs. The sequence of steps, there were many, but the key ones were 1958, Castro comes to power in Cuba. The American government almost immediately sees him as a potential communist threat. And the interesting thing is, according to the Russians themselves, and I can give you references at the end, it's Berlotsky's book about Khrushchev, Castro was not a communist. Raul was, his brother. But Fidel was not a communist until we, according to this account, until we basically pushed him into the Russians' arms. But we treated him that way, and this created tremendous Antagonism, which led in 1961 to a failed invasion attempt, the Bay of Pigs, which created problems on both sides. It made the Cubans and the Russians very fearful of a second American invasion and laid the basis for one of the reasons Khrushchev put his missiles in Cuba. But it also made Americans feel humiliated, and Kennedy was humiliated by this mistake, and there was a lot of pressure both within the executive branch and in Congress to, let's do it right. Let's send the Marines in, an American invasion force, 250,000 troops, and excise the communist cancer in the Western Hemisphere once and for all. The Berlin crisis figured in too, but I don't have time to go into how that happened. In 1961, a year before Khrushchev deployed his missiles in Cuba, we deployed very similar missiles in Turkey. And in fact, it was the deployment of those missiles that was the genesis in Khrushchev's mind of deploying his missiles in Cuba. He said, if they can do that, why shouldn't we deploy missiles in Cuba? The Bay of Pigs clearly played a major role too. And I've already treated those points. Now, the question we're trying to get at is how safe is nuclear deterrence as a strategy? It can be argued that the Cuban Missile Crisis all by itself was a 50% safe maneuver. At least 10%, it was no more than 90% safe, in my opinion, in terms of war between the United States and Russia for reasons you'll see. As I indicated, there was repeated strong support in this country for invading Cuba, and when the missiles were discovered, that reached a fever pitch. And yet, we didn't know it at the time, and this was not adequately considered within Kennedy's advisory group or within Congress when they learned about this. An American invasion force would almost surely have been met with battlefield nuclear weapons that the Russians had on the island and that we were not totally aware of. We knew there might be a possibility, but we discounted it in all of our deliberations that I've seen. We all know, if you've studied this, that there was a Soviet submarine that was running the American naval blockade, and it was forced to surface. That we knew in 1962. What we didn't know until many years later is that that sub carried a nuclear torpedo, that the submarine commander was in a questionable mental state. He thought he was being attacked. We were sending what we thought were signaling depth charges. But we had told Moscow what the signaling depth charges meant, but they hadn't been able to get that information to the submarines, which were in radio silence. Plus, when you're being rocked by these signaling depth charges and there's damage to your physical damage to your submarine, you understandably think you're under attack. Believing that he was under attack and that World War III might be going on up on the surface, there are various accounts, because these are all come from crew members, but one of the accounts is that he gave orders to arm the nuclear torpedo, but was overruled by a battalion commander who was on board, which I suspect actually may have been a political officer rather than a naval officer. But again, if the American destroyers had been vaporized, what would have happened next is anybody's guess. Kennedy is quoted as saying that after the crisis subsided, that the odds of war with Russia were somewhere between 1 in 3 and even. Orders were given for White House staff to evacuate their families from Washington or to have them near a telephone so they could evacuate on a moment's notice. So that's why I say it was potentially a 50% safe maneuver. And how many of those others, what were the risks in all the others? Now, Kennedy may have been trying to puff up his own importance by saying that, but he didn't know about the battlefield nuclear weapons or the nuclear torpedo when he said that. I think he may have actually been on the money. And by the way, part of the agreement for the Russians pulling their missiles out of Cuba was that we pulled our missiles out of Turkey. But Kennedy insisted that that be kept secret, so it would appear that he had been the winner in the crisis, and the Democrats did better in the midterm elections a few weeks later than they were much better than they were expected to do. Now, why Khrushchev agreed to keep it secret, which led to his humiliation and to some extent, maybe a large extent, his removal from power 2 years later, is an open question. Maybe it's because he knew about things like the nuclear torpedo and the battlefield nuclear weapons and how dangerous the situation was. In Dobbs' recent book, 1 Minute to Midnight, he talks about the chaos of trying to move those battlefield nuclear weapons on Cuba in the middle of the night with lights out so that they could strike Guantanamo Bay. And one of the vehicles overturns into a ravine, killing several people, and I think there was a weapon on that vehicle. Now, but again, that was 1962. Nothing like that could possibly happen today. At least that's the belief, and we're very wrong there. We have been pushing for about 10 years, 8 or 10 years, certainly in the Bush administration, to deploy a missile defense system in Eastern Europe to protect, we say, against potential future Iranian threat of ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads. The Russians see it differently. I'm not saying they see it right, but how they see it is very important in terms of the risk that exists. Gorbachev, who's hardly a Cold Warrior, just about a year ago said the whole system is aimed against Russia and China. The Polish government doesn't help matters because in their statements trying to sell the system to their public, they have focused on how the system might be used against the new Russian Topol-M missiles, not against Iran. And so you can see where the Russians who are listening to what the Poles are saying as well as to what we're saying, they don't believe what we're saying anyway, and this reinforces it. Putin, a year and a half ago, warned that similar actions by the Soviet Union when it put rockets in Cuba precipitated the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I've been warning about this for about a year before Putin, at least 6 months and possibly a year before Putin's comments. And so as I saw this unfold, usually I like to be right, but this is one time I was not happy to be proven right. Worse, last summer, there was a potential Cuban bomber crisis that could have rivaled the Cuban Missile Crisis. How many, again, I suspect almost no one's heard about this. How many of you are aware of this? No, just like nobody would have been aware of the Cuban Missile Crisis if it had been headed off before it became the crisis that it was. But we need to watch for these warning signs. On July 21st, Izvestia, which is often used to leak official secrets, just like the Washington Post might be used in this country, reported that an unnamed, very high Air Force official in Moscow said that if the United States proceeded with the deployment of the Eastern European Missile Defense System, Russia would maintain the viability of its nuclear deterrent by basing bombers in Cuba with strategic, that is, nuclear weapons. The next day, and I can give you, my website has references to all these things and links, so you can go back to the original documents. Reuters the next day reported that General Norton Schwartz, now the Air Force Chief of Staff, who was in confirmation hearings at the time, was asked about this, and he replied, "We should stand strong and indicate that as something that crosses a red line." That's kind of what the Russians have been saying about the Eastern European Missile Defense System, but just as we saw the Turkish missiles as a good thing, because they were ours, and the Cuban missiles in '62 as a bad thing, we've got to get our perception straight here, or we're going to walk into disaster. Fortunately, 2 days later, the potential crisis was diffused when the Russian Defense Ministry dismissed the earlier reports as false. But at a minimum, I think you can see what's going on here. There's probably a heated debate within the Russian military over how to respond to what they see as the encirclement of Russia by NATO, American bases, and basically they see very hostile actions. I'm not saying that we intend them that way, but it's important for us to recognize how they see it because that affects how they will respond. We need to know how our adversaries will respond. Maybe they're trying to see what the opinion of the other side is. Yeah. Why don't we hold the questions to the end since it's being taped and we have microphones that can be used? But that's, yes, it could have been a feeler, but that also says something's going on there and gives an indication of the risk. Nuclear terrorism is a new facet to the problem that did not exist in the 60s. Now, the Russians are behaving irresponsibly with respect to Iran's nuclear program, but before we get too mad at them, we ought to recognize that we behaved irresponsibly with respect to Pakistan's nuclear program, which is a horrendous risk right now from many points of view. I mean, that country is descending into chaos, the potential for a regional nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which would produce chaos, and the radical factions within Pakistan then getting their hands on some of these weapons and giving them to al-Qaeda is quite possible. We did that in the 80s because we even violated our own law to do it because we felt we needed to Pakistan's cooperation for getting weapons to the Mujahideen, known today as Osama bin Laden. Again, if you were reading what was going on, I was in the 80s, I knew that these freedom fighters, as we were calling them, were chanting death to America around their campfires at night. But most Americans were and still are to some extent in the Charlie Wilson's war viewpoint of, let's go kill Russians. And they were freedom fighters. We've got to really get smart about what we're doing or we're going to get in big trouble. What about commercial nuclear power has another problem with it. We have a program called Atoms for Peace instituted by Eisenhower, which is an oxymoron, in my opinion, at least under the current approach. Ted Taylor was one of this nation's most brilliant nuclear weapons designers for the first 20 years of his career. And when I worked with him in the 80s, he's now deceased, he told me he was trying to undo with the second half of his life what he had done with the first half. And he told me that every nation with a commercial nuclear power reactor is in a state of latent proliferation, meaning if they kick out the inspectors, and are we really going to go to war over someone kicking out inspectors? They could build at least a crude nuclear device in 6 months to 2 years. Now, Ted was so good at designing nuclear weapons that he probably was underestimating the situation, but still, I think it's an indication of the danger. There's an important coupling between nuclear terrorism and nuclear war. A nuclear terrorist incident that made New York or Moscow or Tel Aviv go up in smoke would produce chaos and would move us to a very dangerous situation where, in fact, I'll describe that in a minute. So what's to be done? Well, all the old arguments, all the old approaches have almost as much validity, many of them just as much validity today as they did 30, 40 years ago. Trouble is people are tired of hearing them, so new approaches are not necessarily needed but are valuable. And I came up with a new approach about 2 years ago that has certain other advantages and which is where I'm putting all my focus and which I hope you'll support in ways I'll explain at the end. It's called risk analysis of nuclear deterrence. It's based on two simple observations which when combined produce a very surprising result. First observation, even minor changes, even small perturbations in our nuclear weapons strategy, like the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, were rejected by the Senate in the late 90s as too risky, and while Obama's going to bring it back again, there will be opposition. And again, they'll say not testing is too risky, even though we haven't tested in that time. Now, the other observation is, until I did a preliminary risk analysis, which I published just about a year ago, no one had estimated the risk of nuclear deterrence failing. Putting those together is the surprising result. How can rational decisions be made among alternatives, including the status quo, if you don't know the baseline risk that we suffer right now? My preliminary analysis, and there's a link to an online version of the paper on the website I'll give you at the end. My preliminary analysis indicates that the risk of deterrence failing is at least 1,000 and probably possibly 10,000 times greater than having a nuclear power plant built next to, let's say we're all at Google, built in Milpitas. Equivalently, build a nuclear power plant in Milpitas, one in Palo Alto, surround Google with probably 3 or 4 nuclear power plants, build another ring around that, keep going until you've got at least 1,000 and possibly 10,000. That's the risk that each and every one of us faces, according to my preliminary estimate, from nuclear deterrence failing. Now, in the 80s, when I used to talk on this issue, I would use the diagram shown here. It involves it's a two-state model. In fact, those of you who know some probability theory, it was a two-state Markov model. And the current state of the world is on the left, and what I used to call post-World War III was on the right. You'll see why I call it nuclear disaster instead right now. And I said that there was a transition possibility from our current state of the world to post-World War III, but it was a state of no return. Civilization would be destroyed, so there was no arrow coming back. And if the transition probability stayed bigger than any fixed epsilon naught, you're absorbed with probability 1. But that's not the way I will describe it today, and I didn't usually describe it then. Now, people have trouble with this. They look at the current state of the world and say, how could we possibly have a nuclear war? I mean, I don't see any danger. That's because I realized, and this is only my new approach with risk analysis, I realized the current state of the world really consists of a large number of substates. And the substate we're in right now is probably the one in the middle. That's the one that does not have a transition to a nuclear disaster state. And so people are right. It's impossible from the current substate of the world, not the current state of the world, but the current substate, to have a nuclear war. But it's possible to put missiles in Turkey or in Poland and move one step toward the brink. And it's a sequence of steps, and we're not very good at thinking several moves out like that. And that's what I'm arguing we need to do, and that risk analysis will help us do. I also realized, and this isn't in the online version of the paper, I've only done this more recently, that the nuclear disaster state also has a number of substates. So, for example, a nuclear terrorist incident, or a dirty bomb, or a commander, a regional nuclear war between India and Pakistan, things like that move us into the first state of nuclear disaster, which is a state that allows a return back where nuclear weapons are not being used. The civilization has not been destroyed. But once enough nuclear weapons have been used, as each one is used, there's more risk of escalation. And so, again, to get to the final state in which civilization is destroyed would take a number of steps. But I have to argue that even the first state in this nuclear disaster state, like New York going up in smoke or San Francisco, is totally unacceptable if we can avoid it, and I believe we can if we get smart. Now, there's another piece of the picture that I just showed, which is the current state of the world is really in the middle of the current substate of the world is in the middle of a number of superstates. And it is possible to make moves to make the world safer, to reduce the risk of disaster. For example, I believe, not everyone agrees, but ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty would be a good thing. And that would move us a small step in the safe direction. Reducing our weapons from 25,000 worldwide to just a couple of thousand would again reduce the risk. Reducing it to a couple of hundred would reduce it even further, and we still would have a very credible nuclear deterrent. And so there are a number of steps we can take. And so it's important to be able to envision the inconceivable not only in the negative direction, but it's equally important, maybe even more important, to be able to envision the inconceivable in the positive direction. Because if people are scared stiff, they do nothing. They need to be energized and see that it's possible to change things. And so some people have ridiculed the Gang of Four, Shultz, Perry, Kissinger, and Nunn, for their op-eds in which they pose the vision of a world free of nuclear weapons. They're not calling for immediate nuclear disarmament, but they're saying we need to have that as our ultimate goal. Harold Brown and John Deutsch, both from Democratic administrations, CIA Director and Secretary of Defense, published a rejoinder to that called The Nuclear Disarmament Fantasy, in which they argued that even the aspirational goal of a world free of nuclear weapons was dangerous. And again, I have links to that on my website. And I think that's because they're thinking about the current substate of the world. In the current substate of the world, it would be dangerous to get down to just 3 nuclear weapons on both sides, but for various reasons. But if we make the world safer and safer and safer, then things that are currently inconceivable and dangerous might become conceivable and much safer. The state of acceptable risk must be a state of no return. If there's a return arrow, then you have what's called an ergodic Markov chain, and actually the risk in the long run is not going to be acceptable. Now, we do have precedents. In 1787, when the American Constitution was written, slavery was written into that in terms of both the slave trade going on for, I think, another 20 years, and the 3/5 rule, how slaves would be counted. Anyone who proposed getting rid of slavery in 1787 would have been laughed at as living in fantasy land. But it was possible through public concern being developed, books being published, people thinking about the issue, to eventually abolish slavery in this country. And interestingly, the abolitionists originally had women's suffrage as part of their platform. They wanted to free black men and give women the vote at the same time. Sometime, I think it was the 1840s, they dropped women's suffrage. Do you know why? Because it was viewed that women's suffrage was so much more radical than ending slavery, so much more fantastic, that if they kept the two linked, it would prolong slavery by decades. And in fact, if you look at the time between the two constitutional amendments, it was 55 years. So again, envisioning the inconceivable. Anyone who proposed taking your vote away today because you're a woman would be laughed at just as roundly as people who proposed giving it to you 200 years ago. And in the same way, there are possibilities for making the world safe at that state of acceptable risk. Now, I do have to get cryptography in here since it was in the title. In 1970, which was roughly when I started working in cryptography, all my colleagues, and I don't think that's an overstatement, told me I was crazy, and they had two good reasons. NSA had a multi-billion-dollar budget for decades. How could I hope to discover something they didn't already know? And if I did anything good, they would classify it. Both of those arguments had validity and came back to haunt me. But in hindsight, you'd have to say I was wise to do the crazy, foolish thing and work on it anyway. But it took a sequence of steps. It was only, for a long time, people thought I was crazy. Fortunately, I met Whit Diffie and Ralph Merkle, and we were able to do some things, and eventually there's a whole industry based on this. But again, it was inconceivable. Now, a state of acceptable risk, what does it mean? Well, if the proposed studies, the next step in the process that I'm proposing, and you'll see it on a slide in a minute, is for a group like the National Academies, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Institute of Medicine, to undertake an in-depth study to either correct or confirm my preliminary conclusions. We need an objective, in-depth study by a prestigious, knowledgeable group. And then that could be used, if it confirms my concern, even within an order of magnitude or two, then it could be used as a vehicle for getting the public support that's needed for changes in policy. But if I'm right, the risk has to be reduced by at least a factor of 1,000 and maybe 10,000. And so that implies a long-term, multi-stage process of change. It's not going to happen with the Cold War ending, for example. And I was really beside myself with concern when the public concern in the 80s evaporated with the end of the Cold War. I knew the problem was not solved. At best, we left it to our children. And yet all that concern evaporated. That can't happen again. Now, some would say that the state of acceptable risk involves nuclear abolition, getting rid of nuclear weapons, a world free of nuclear weapons. Maybe our current president even believes that based on his speech in Prague last month. Schultz, Perry, Kissinger, and Nunn, two Democrats and two Republicans, have certainly posed it as a vision for the state of acceptable risk. Others would say it's going to take world peace. Others would say it's going to take world government. All three of those tend to produce derision and arguments about why they're impossible. The nice thing about calling it a state of acceptable risk, I don't have to describe it explicitly. However we get there's fine. If the abolitionists are right, we'll discover that further out in the process. If the world peace people are right, we'll discover that further out in the process, and so on. Instead of arguing about the nature of the end state and whether it's achievable or not, let's focus our energies on the first step, which is learning how much risk we actually face today and whether we need to do something. So risk analysis avoids a major stumbling block, which is another reason I've focused my energies here. The advantages of it: the first step is inarguable. Unlike the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which has been rejected and may well be rejected again as too risky, if anything, it's too risky not to know how much risk we face. The later steps, as I've pointed out, are implicit, not explicit. I don't have to say get rid of all nuclear weapons. I don't have to say world peace or whatever it is I think it's going to be. It's a state of acceptable risk. If what I think it is right, we'll discover it further out. If I'm wrong, we'll discover that. The sequence of implicit steps leads to a complete solution. If we learn that the risk is 1,000 times too great, then if we have a major advance that reduces the risk by a factor of 5 or 10, can we stop? No, it's still 100 to 200 times too risky. And so I think that's a very important characteristic. And I also think, although I haven't had success with this, I've been doing this for about a year now, I thought that the first step, these risk analysis studies, could unify disparate groups, whether they're working for world peace, whether they're trying to strengthen the UN or some other form of world government, whether they're working for nuclear arms control or abolition, understanding the baseline risk would seem to be a good place to start. Okay, remember envisioning the inconceivable. This is how most people see the situation, and it's, in fact, for 25 years roughly, that's how I looked at it, although I understood, but it wasn't saying explicitly about all those substates that help people to get a hold of why, even though there's very little risk today, over the next 5 or 10 years and over the lifetime of a child born today, the risk is considerable. And also it's important to remember we can also move in the other direction. Keep in mind ending slavery, women getting the vote, and public key cryptography. So I call the website Defusing the Nuclear Threat. The details are on nuclearrisk.org, and there's this wonderful search engine. What's it called? That you can put in, no, not Yahoo. You can put in Hellman and nuclear and risk, and it'll take you right there. In fact, Hellman and nuclear might well get you there, although there's some stuff on my Stanford website as well. It has the article on which this talk is based, and the original paper as well. It also has a statement, and many of these things are, the resource tab is a good one to go to. It's got emails on the Georgian War and all those references. There's a statement that concludes, we the undersigned, and I'll tell you who they are in a minute, urgently petition the international scientific community to undertake in-depth risk analyses of nuclear deterrence, and if the results so indicate, to raise an alarm alerting society to the unacceptable risk it faces, as well as initiating a second phase effort to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. I'm paraphrasing. So who signed that? Kenneth Arrow, a 1972 Nobel laureate in economics, and it seems to about half of his, he's an expert on economic risk. Jim Bidzos, chairman of VeriSign, until recently also the CEO, acting CEO. He got a replacement in January, I hope I'll be able to see him again. Dick Garwin, who most people have not heard of, but he's very well thought of in the defense community. Teller, in a moment of honesty, admitted that Garwin was the one to figure out how to make the H-bomb work in the early 50s. He did it in the summer, visiting for a summer from the University of Chicago. He was an assistant professor. Brilliant man. Fermi is quoted as saying, Garwin's the only true genius he ever met. So Garwin has signed the statement. Admiral Inman, the former director of the National Security Agency, my old nemesis, those of you who remember the 70s, we actually became friends and trust each other now. He signed the statement. He's also a former deputy director of the CIA. Bill Kays, who was a dean of engineering at Stanford, Don Kennedy, one of our past presidents at Stanford. So it has the support of some very knowledgeable people. Oh, and Martin Pearl, Nobel laureate in physics, also at Stanford, sorry. Now, this seems like such a huge problem, you might wonder, what role could I possibly play? But you have a critical role. Everybody has a critical role. But at Google, you might have an extra role that I'll explain. People only believe what the media and politicians say, and the media and politicians can only say what the public believes. In fact, Obama, during the primaries, had said at one point that he would not use nuclear weapons in Pakistan against the terrorists. And he was hit so hard on that by Hillary Clinton that he had to backtrack. So the politicians are constrained by what we will let them do. It's a catch-22. How can you get public attention for this? And the critical thing is getting to about 5% of a population. At that point, it's enough of a mass audience that the mass media begins to pay attention. So the key is getting from 0 to 5%. From 5 to 50 is much easier. And so if you agree, please bring this up with others. And in fact, I have a model that Google could become a self-sustaining chain reaction. 5% of the American population is 15 million people. 5% of Google is only 1 million people, right? That's supposed to be a joke, okay. You're not that big yet, 20 million Googlers. But Google is a much smaller population. You guys come together on a daily basis. If 5% of you were to really take this on and have the courage, and it takes courage to bring it up, when people say, what's new, what are you concerned about? People would hear about it repeatedly, and more people would start to pay attention. So anyone interested in doing that, contact me. We might be able to start a Googlers for Sanity group. Visit the website. There's a little Join Us box. Not much happens right now. You put your email there, and I send you updates. At some point, more may happen. It's important to have a list of supporters. Finally, our slogan, which reads, "The risk of a nuclear catastrophe is far greater than we think, but our ability to reduce that risk is far greater than we imagine." So there I will stop, and do we have time for questions? A few minutes? That took a little longer than I thought. I guess we're not bad.
So thank you, Martin. I also want to make an announcement. Any of those of you who would like to join us for lunch, just meet us here at the podium after the talk in about 10 minutes. Before I take your question, I do want to, you can stand up though. I do have a question from somebody who's unable to attend and sent me an email. The question is, the web article focuses on a potential American-Russian nuclear conflict. Does Iran's quest for nuclear weapons change anything?
Yes, it makes the situation more dangerous. I've had a continual problem in writing these papers, and in the Soaring, Cryptography, Nuclear Weapons, when there's almost no mention of nuclear terrorism, I was able to get it into the previous article. I found a way to work it in. It's a question of flow. Certainly, nuclear terrorism is one of those substates in the nuclear disaster state that greatly increases the risk and needs to be taken into account. I absolutely agree. The Taubetta Pi paper, the earlier paper, explains why focusing on just nuclear terrorism, though, is not what we need to do. We need to look at both of them together.
So a big part of your talk was in trying to understand the risk in a scientific sense of a nuclear disaster. Back in the 70s, and I'm sorry if you covered this, there was the notion of the doomsday clock.
Oh.
Was that just theater, or was that a similar...
The doomsday clock or doomsday machine?
I thought it was a doomsday clock.
Well, the doomsday clock is the bulletin of the American Scientist that says whether it's 5 minutes to midnight or 10 minutes to midnight or 1 minute to midnight.
Was that actually a similarly thought out probability analysis of the likelihood of nuclear disaster, or was that just theater?
No, and it still exists. I think they still have the clock. I'd have to check. No, I think that was a subjective estimate. And that's the whole idea, is to bring quantitative risk analysis to bear. And it's like analyzing the risk associated with a nuclear power plant design that's never failed. And all American power designs have never failed catastrophically. Even 3 Mile Island was only a partial meltdown and no one was killed in it. How do they estimate the risk of those when they haven't had a failure? It's the same way you do it here. You break it down into a sequence of events, each of which you have a much better idea for. Okay, question here, or comment.
Marty, you are known as an author of protocols that establish trust between parties. So I wanted to ask, is it possible to design protocols that would establish kind of trust between nuclear-armed parties?
Is it? Okay. Yes, it is, but it's not going to involve number theory. It's going to involve much more psychology. We need to understand, I think the fundamental problem is fear, anger, and hatred. If you look at the mess we're in Iran and Iraq, not Iran yet, thank God, Iraq and Afghanistan right now, it really stems from September 11th. And if you trace September 11th back, you get back to the Mujahideen and what we did in Afghanistan. In hindsight, I think it could be argued, I'm not going to say it's true, but it could be argued that letting the Russians maintain some semblance of order in Afghanistan would have been in America's best interest, and we should have helped them rather than hurt them. Under the current government, which is American-supported, it is a capital crime to convert from Islam to Christianity. In fact, there was a case on this last year that President Bush was able to help the guy get out, because thank God Bush was a good Christian. But it's still on the books, I'm pretty sure. Under the Russian puppet government, I don't think it would have been against the law. You would have been sanctioned for practicing religion as you were in the Soviet Union, but you would probably not have been killed for it. So we need to get much smarter and start looking at why we hate and fear so much.
So risks are all relative. So I guess I'm trying to understand where the nuclear risk is in relation to things associated with global warming and then with the current economic climate.
Okay, section 6, I have a primer. The resource page of my website has a primer with 6 sections. The 6th one is called What About Global Warming? I encourage you to take a look there. But the short version is there are many problems facing us. There is an underlying theme to all the ones I've looked at, and that is that technology has given human beings godlike power. We can create new life forms, we can destroy civilization, things that historically only God was supposed to have the power to do. Our social development is not godlike. I would estimate that at best we're in our adolescence, and so the analogy I make on that page is we're like a 16-year-old with a new driver's license who gets his hands on a 500 horsepower Ferrari. And so we're either going to grow up really fast or we're going to kill ourselves. And if we can get the public to pay attention to any one of these problems that stems from that chasm between our technological, our physical power, and our social development, then I hope we will use it to deal with all of them. We need to start thinking long range. That's the fundamental problem, I agree. I focused on this one because I think it's the one that's most inarguable. With global warming, people are still saying, let's wait and see. And unfortunately, they have a better argument there than they do here. Anyone who says, let's wait and see here, it's much harder. And that's why I focused on this one, but I'm very concerned about that. Any other questions? Okay, well, why don't we end here? I'll stick around, and I'll be having lunch too. Thank you very much.